We're going to look now at a situation that has just become a situation before the International Criminal Court. So another of these international courts that we're going to look at, and it concerns the post-election violence in Kenya in 2008. Kenya was a party that signed the Treaty of Rome. It has ratified that treaty, which created the International Criminal Court, so a fully paid up member of the international justice system. There are 108 countries that have signed up to give the ICC jurisdiction over their affairs, and some 65 or so, which included Kenya, who had ratified the treaty. Let's look at the background again. I'm doing this because it's very important. On domestic cases, we know the background. We know that if someone comes from a particular area of London, we can picture it. Here, when you're dealing internationally, really helps to know a little bit about the countries. 40 ethnic groups amongst 36 million people, various tribes, which you can see in the slide there. Kikuyu, the most dominant. In 2007, 160 registered parties. The election was at the end of 2007, 31st of December 2007. Currently, there are now 38 parties, and there has been a reform of the party political system. There were two leading factions or coalitions for the 2007 elections. The first, PNU, led by a man called Kibaki. That was a coalition of about 15 different parties. Amongst them, KANU, which was led by Jomo Kenyatta's son, Uhuru. Kenyatta being the founder of the Kenyan nation. The other group, ODM, Orange Democratic Movement. Where have we heard that before? Remember, Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, very attractive blonde girl, I can remember her. I can't remember what the bloke was like, but she was a cracker. And alleged the stolen election, all that was CIA inspired actually, and said that the party, which had got 65% of the votes and was backed by the Russians, had stolen the election, taken it away from the people, and you had this Orange Democratic Movement, took to the streets and forced issues. Eventually that all collapsed, and the blonde went in with the Russian guy, and the other guy became ill, and I don't know what happened to him. I think he may have shrugged off his mortal coil. But there we have it. Run by a man called Odinga. And quite an interesting little connection there, I think, between the ODM and Orange and what took place in Kenya. What happened in the post-election violence, as of the 1st of January, a town called Eldoret was attacked, principally by people from the ODM movement. That's up in the north west of Kenya, and that kicked it off, and then around until March, between 1,200 or 1,500 people killed, 350,000 people displaced, lots of allegations of ethnic cleansing, and a lot of property destroyed, and a lot of the population moved up from the central Rift Valley over into Uganda. There was within Kenya a commission set up by the Kenyans called the Waki Report, Waki Commission, and he was a High Court judge in the Kenyan justice system who took evidence in 2007 during an assessment of the post-election violence and made a report which became a report that was sent to the International Criminal Court. He made various findings, and there were certain significant events that he referred to as to being significant as to what happened in Kenya. There had been a movement that had started from about October as the elections were hotting up. Various areas had objected to other ethnic groups coming into their territory, if you like. In the central Rift Valley, there was objection to Kikuyu people who were living there. In Eldoret, the same thing. In the Navasha area, there was an objection to the Luo people. There was the usual thing you get in elections in Africa and other places like that, whereby people are trying to get the vote. And the easiest way is say, I'll protect you from these people coming into your area. Nothing really that shattering or shocking. Just part of life there. That's how it is. Gradually, things took a distinct turn for the worse, though, and violence began erupting in one or two places. Particularly was noticeable that inflammatory language was being used by politicians. In this time of December 2007, the Orange Democratic Movement were alleging that there was going to be, that the election had been stolen. The election hadn't even happened then, but they couldn't wait their moment, and they were using the tactics from Ukraine. They were alleging that the election had been stolen, that the ballots were going to be false, and you mention anything like that, and the European Union, UN, all get their NGOs into helicopters and planes, and they all bus in for a bit of human rights tourism and looking at what's going on, and that's really what it is. And on the weekends, they're all off in the safari park. These photos are actually after the election had taken place and were for the benefit of a programme that was put on BBC Newsnight. Various meetings taking place in the townships spread around Kenya. Lots of words being said against ODM and PNU coalition. Threats of eviction, that kind of thing. But nothing that was to take the form of the violence that happened after the election. Stuff that was happening which would be significant in England, but I think in these states, because getting into power means that you've got access to money and you've got access to all sorts of things. I think the more competitive nature of the elections often causes the more inflammatory statements that are being made. Voting started on the 27th of December. Straight away, the ODM was saying that the PNU had rigged the ballots and the voting, and violence was erupting at various ballot stations across Kenya. So the voting had been rigged, and I want you to remember that phrase and remember that the ODM was saying it against the PNU, because there's an interesting fact that has been overlooked by the internationals, in my view, in their assessment of what happened there. ODM supporters take to the streets of Nakuru, saying that the election results haven't been released. Well, they were still coming in from around the country. Kenya has a commissioner of elections who supervises the elections, and ballots are counted under a statutory scheme which is part of the Kenyan constitution. Various groups were urged by the ODM to make their protests, and particular towns like Nakuru and Naivasha were targeted for demonstrations. And so essentially this is coming from one side at this stage, which is the Orange Democratic Movement, who had as its end the idea that it wanted to shout foul over the elections. There were announcements that some of the returning officers of the ballot hadn't yet returned their results. That was done publicly by Kivutu, who is the Electoral Commission chairman of Kenya, and immediately allegations were also made that some of the results were being cooked, which was the phrase that was used, and still trouble was happening. There was a meeting between the two main parliaments, the two main parties, the ODM and PNU, to review the ballot. Neither could agree about the tallying of the votes, and the Electoral Commission chairman had to be escorted from the room as tempers ran high. And then the ODM party produced an official claiming he'd witnessed the commission authorities manipulating the votes, and there was a broadcast later on the 30th of December that Kibaki of the PNU was the winner of the 2007 election. Now let's just look at those figures. In fact, the ODM had won 90 seats, so it had actually won the largest number of seats. Kibaki's party had only won 40, KANU 20, the other ones groups of 10, 15, whatever, but they formed a coalition, rather like we have the Brokeback Coalition. They formed the coalition, and they had the majority of seats in the parliament, and so they were able to go into government. So the early allegations of rigging the election don't quite fit with the usual concept of how an election is rigged so that you give yourself the majority of the votes. In fact, the Orange Democratic Movement had a clear majority by 50 seats above any other party. But it was the fact of a coalition, which they knew was going to happen, which was the stumbling block for them entering into power, becoming president, and forming the government. So, temperatures start to rise, there is violence, rape and looting, the mob are incensed, a minor wave of retaliatory attacks occur. About after a week or so, the other side start retaliating on the initial attacks, which were the precursors of the greater violence.